Ciao everyone and welcome to a new episode of Voices of Italy Beyond La Dolce Vita. Before we dive in today, I have some exciting news. Voices of Italy now has its own website. You can visit voicesofitalypodcast.com to find all past episodes, links to every listening platform, and more about the podcast itself, including how to reach out if you'd like to share your stories, feedback, or ideas. It might be just a website, but for this little podcast, it feels like a huge step ahead. I hope you'll take a look, have some fun exploring it, and maybe even have a good laugh at my web design skills. And speaking of laughs, let's get into today's episode. If there's one thing that us Italians do best is turning everything into a joke, often about ourselves, sometimes about our miseries, and almost always about things that we should probably take a little more seriously. Our humor is a mix of self-mockery, cynicism, victimism, and stereotypes, but most importantly, it exposes a lot of things about Italian society, our fears, our desires, and our deepest hypocrisies sometimes. In 2009, prominent Italian journalist Ernesto Galli della Loggia described the country's most popular comedies as a long, obscene writing on the wall of a station toilet. He was talking about a very Italian comedy genre called the cinepanettone. I have to admit, I kind of agree with his opinion because over the years, the Italian entertainment industry, when it comes to comedies, has moved from the masterpieces of Commedia all'Italiana to a modern comedy that often leans on vulgarity and over the top buffooneries to reach a laugh. Yet, as the same critic also said, this lowbrow humor reveals, quote, the real country, its culture, its impulses, its truth. And in this episode, we're diving into how Italian comedy has evolved from Totò's linguistic genius to streaming era sarcasm, and what our laughter really says about Italy, of course. Italy is one of the most iconic countries in the world. But what does Italy mean to the world? What does it mean to you?
Buongiorno.
Pizza.
Ciao Bella.
Michelangelo.
Spaghetti.
Mafia. Dolce Vita.
My name is Alessia, I'm Italian, and this is Voices of Italy, the podcast that peels back the layers of the Instagram perfect Italy to reveal everyday stories of authentic, surprising, and messy Italian life. Been wanting to talk about Italian comedy for a long time on the podcast because honestly, it's really one of the best ways to understand who we are, how we deal with power, frustration, and change. In short, it's a perfect topic for Voices of Italy to talk about. And if Italian comedy has an origin story, it's Commedia all'Italiana. So, Italian style comedy, literally. It refers to a whole period roughly from the late 50s to the early 70s, during which the movies that were produced were tragic stories with a humorous tone. And it was an incredible representation of the Italian national character and also a form of social critique that was exposing the vices and the hypocrisies of the average Italian citizen, the corruption of society, the lack of civic sense. And the main characters in these movies became sort of national mirrors. They lied, cheated, and faked their way through life, not because they were bad people, but because they were trying to survive. They had to do those things. They were ambitious and insecure, vulgar and lovable, pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. And a lot of these traits still permeates our humor, how we think about what's funny and how to make things funny. In the Commedia all'Italiana, legendary actors like Alberto Sordi, Vittorio Gassman, Totò, and Ugo Tognazzi really made history, but nobody captured the spirit better than Totò. He was really the genius of absurdity and wordplay of his time. And before comedy became social commentary, he made it like a linguistic rebellion. Totò was basically teaching ordinary people how to laugh at authority, how to see through the polished language of the powerful to survive in modern Italy. And The funny thing is that when I was writing this episode, my mom was flipping through channels on TV and stumbled upon the final scenes of an old black and white movie called Totò e i Re di Roma. Totò and the Kings of Rome. I had never watched it before, but I gave it a try and it felt really like a sign because I was really trying to find a way to give you an idea of what that world, those movies, that kind of humor was all about. And that was just perfect. Totò in this movie plays character Ercole Pappalardo, a humble archivist, the kind of man crushed by the bureaucracy and absurdity of a system that doesn't really see him and takes advantage of him constantly. And like many comedies of that time, the laughter comes from discomfort, from the everyday humiliations that feel both tragic and ridiculous. And oh my God, if you're not Italian or you've never lived here, you have no clue how accurate this all sounds, even today, which is a bit worrying because it was a long time ago. But anyway, let's move forward. The ending of the movie really captures the spirit. In the end, after a lifetime of small humiliations and moral compromises, Ercole dies, only to realize that the afterlife is not all clouds and angels as he imagined, but a grand hall that feels suspiciously like a government building. Yes, he finds himself waiting in yet another line to prove that he is officially dead because, yes, he has to prove so. And even in the afterlife, there's paperwork. That's how Italian this movie is. It was really, that it really gave me that frustrated laugh that Italians sometimes we have. Like it's something that is deeply touching a sensitive chord, but it makes me laugh for how accurate that is about reality. And going back to the movie, at the end of yet another long bureaucratic process, a celestial clerk informs Ercole that he is to stand trial before Saint Peter, who reads his life like it was a bureaucratic report. All his small lies, his cowardice, his blind obedience to power. And Ercole desperately pleads his case. He wasn't a bad man. He was just poor and scared, and so he had to do what he needed to survive. And for a moment, it seems like St. Peter might understand, but then condemns him to return on earth as a horse, forever carrying burdens. Is the perfect metaphor of the kind of Italians they wanted to describe. Italians trapped in an absurd and highly bureaucratized system, complaining about it constantly, but somehow never breaking free. And again, this sounds particularly familiar even today as a picture. But as Italy hurtled into the 60s, the Commedia all'italiana becomes more cynical and sharp. And here there was a new comedic icon that really emerged super strongly, and is the character of Ragionier Ugo Fantozzi. Italians listening right now obviously will know who this is because it's a hugely famous character created and portrayed by Paolo Villaggio. He is the opposite of the charming con men and social climbers of the earlier films. He is a submissive office clerk, constantly humiliated, unlucky, and hopeless on all fronts. And that's exactly why we love him. He is the symbol of an Italian society perceived largely as unfair and oppressive. His suffering becomes sort of symbolic because Italians saw themselves in him, this powerless worker stuck in an unfair system. His failures really made ourselves feel less heavy watching him. And as a millennial, Fantozzi was still an incredibly popular character, even though it wasn't that recent anymore. And at that point, really, for us, it was more of a symbol. So powerful that it left a mark even in a language, too. The word Fantozziano, for example, is an adjective that derived from the character's name and started to be used to describe any absurdly unlucky or pathetic situation. And of course, the other famous expression that Fantozzi left is the nuvola di Fantozzi, Fantozzi's Cloud, from the movies in which the character was constantly hunted by this literal cloud following him everywhere with rain and ruining his plans every time. It became a national inside joke for almost every supernatural misfortune that haunts you when wherever you go, or for the literal rain when it follows you wherever you go, again, to as a symbol of bad luck. But fast forward to the 1980s, Italy was richer, flashier, louder, and so was its comedy. This is when the cinepanettone genre was born. Even though the word itself was created later in the 90s, it's basically a mix between the word cinema and panettone, a traditional Christmas cake, let's say. And the was initially used to refer to comedy movies that were completely dominating the box office and becoming again this sort of Christmas ritual in those years. I remember watching a couple of those movies in the theaters myself when I was a kid, and they were considered very family friendly movies, just fun, family friendly movies. But honestly, even as a kid, I was never a huge fan. They had very simple plots, and the humor was entirely based around physical gags, sexual allusions, and stock characters portraying some kind of regional, gender, or social stereotype. And the absolute stars of these genres were Massimo Boldi and Christian De Sica. They were really household names. They had like their very own cinepanettone universe in a way, playing the same characters in endless variations in the different movies as businessmen, cheaters, tourists, and they have been very criticized for this as actors, especially because Christian De Sica, he's the son of another legendary Italian actor, Vittorio De Sica. The comparison was obviously inevitable, but the movies themselves, more than anything, received a lot of criticism despite their huge popularity. At the beginning, the term cinepanettone itself was originally used with a negative connotation to criticize them, mainly because they were based on, again, very simple humor, relying mainly on physical gags and gross vulgarity. Plots were non existent almost, and again, for the heavy use of stereotypes. Personally, one of the things that, even as a kid, again, made me dislike them was the representation of women in those movies. They were almost always reduced to mere sexual objects with no personality, no other role in the plot other than being the object of the all the other men's desire all the time. Really, for me, it just didn't feel interesting. It didn't feel fun, honestly, even as a kid. And that's the kind of movies that Ernesto Galli della Loggia was referring to. And that's why I'm not so much in disagreement with him when he called them an obscene writing on the wall of the station toilet. Because in a way, they were, raw, noisy, absolutely Italian. And if you've ever been at an Italian station toilet, you know what I'm talking about. And that's maybe why people love them at the same time. Those movies didn't pretend to be something they weren't. They were just, giving you what you want, what we really know makes you laugh, guys. But this is not to say that all Italian comedy movies are bad or that the very successful ones are all bad across the board. It's really a genre that started to use and reuse all those elements over and over and over, to the point that, even if you can consider one or two of them actually funny, then it must come to a point where you get bored of seeing the same thing over and over again. And more recently, there is another comedy star that sort of replaced, in a way, Cinepanettoni for that huge, undisputed popularity. And I'm referring to Checco Zalone. You cannot talk about modern Italian comedy without mentioning him. He broke every box office record and brought something new in a way, or maybe something ancient, depending on how you look at it, back to the screen. Average Italian, Italiano medio, as we see him as we actually imagine it. His movies have had this huge cultural impact that hasn't been seen in a long time. That's why I was saying that maybe he's actually bringing back something that belongs to the Commedia all'Italiana time. Even though his comedy style was also often criticized for its use of banal or sexist jokes, he was also praised for the quality of his writing, which is what actually sets him apart from the other comedies like the cinepanettoni. And the main reason people talk about the Zalone phenomenon is that really he shattered every box office record, and this made him really an economic powerhouse in Italian cinema. But when it comes to his comedy style, in a mainstream landscape where humor is often criticized for being too cheesy or full of superficial vulgarity, and in itself, Zalone has offered a winning combination of popular humor and a solid narrative foundation. And the character himself is politically incorrect, lazy, opportunistic, but also familiar. He's our mirror, again, for better or worse. And it's interesting to see also where he started, because in the early 2000s, Italian TV comedy was really everywhere. And in particular, it was a show called Zelig, from the name of the theater where it was filmed, that became really a huge phenomenon in those years, launching many successful careers, including Checco Zalone, but also other famous Italian comedians like Ficarra and Picone and Ale and Franz, that all started there, or at least their major popularity really started there at Zelig. The style of programs like Zelig is heavily rooted in Italian cabaret tradition, which is very different from the modern concept of stand up comedy as we think of it in the US or in the UK. The humor in mainstream Italian TV is often full of cliches and with sketches that are often highly visual, relying on eccentric outfit, exaggerated body language, or catchphrases to quickly land a laugh. Looking back, that comedy feels safe in a way because it rarely took any risks or challenged power or stereotypes. Maybe because, well, it aired on Berlusconi's networks. Definitely, that sets the tone. And the jokes were light, never dangerous, but fun, predictable. And younger audiences eventually just stopped watching. That popularity wasn't really able to keep up with the trend changes. Today, there is a new generation of comedians that is often associated with and inspired by American stand up tradition a lot of times, and is actively trying to change this narrative and these formats. Until a few years ago, to be honest, I had never really watched any stand up comedy myself, because when I thought about a comedian performing on a stage, I thought more than anything to, again, this cabaret style that is popular in Italy, which is very different from stand up comedy in that. Um, Again, it's usually based around a character with certain catchphrases. There's no really improvisation, and the humor is very loud. It's based around this caricature character. Well, stand up is something that I started to discover more recently through Netflix and comedians, and it was such a revelation to me. There's something raw and liberating about it. It's refreshing also to see Italian comedians finally exploring this kind of formats, and in general new things, making comedy a little more personal, a little more authentic, and a little more sophisticated as well. Of course, this new scene still lives in kind of its parallel world in Italy between live clubs, social media, streaming platforms, because mainstream TV isn't quite ready for it just yet. There's still a lot of resistance from traditional media, which tends to play it safe and underestimate its audience in a way. Or in any case, it tends to not take any risks with innovative formats, and unless they're already proven to be very successful somewhere else, then maybe they do some attempt, but still keeping in mind that their main target is usually an audience that is made of middle aged to elderly Italian people, and there's a lot of those, and they watch TV more than anyone else in Italy, of course, because younger generations now have the internet to provide fun. One of my absolute favorites in this new Italian comedy scene is Francesco De Carlo. He is really sharp, honest, and unapologetically Italian millennial. And he's very self aware in that in his comedy. Is one of the few who's managed to really become successful internationally by performing in English. You can find a lot of his work online, and there are also some hilarious crowd work shows on YouTube. What I love about comedians like him is that they talk about Italians exactly as we are today, for the good and for the bad, with affection, but also without filters and with some, more sophisticated social critique elements. And I feel like in Italy, especially maybe in the entertainment and artistic sector, it's very difficult. It's very, very difficult to break those entry barriers. And even according to Francesco De Carlo himself in a recent podcast interview, he said that most mainstream Italian comedy is still very conservative at its very core, and that it comforts the public instead of challenging it, relying on the same tired stereotypes like North versus South, men versus women, rich versus poor, instead of creating new conversation. And he also said that the role of a comedian should be to create a context where uncomfortable or taboo things can be said instead of sort of infantilize the audience. And I could not agree more. It also points out something very fascinating. In Italy, comedy is limited by both cultural and legal moralism, because unlike the US, where comedians literally fought for the right of using offensive language as a form of free expression, or in any case, of language that is maybe largely considered politically incorrect in other contexts. But here, even public blasphemy is still literally legally restricted. And this fear of freedom, of change, I think is exactly why so much mainstream content still feels banal and assumes that the audience is stupid or old or both, and it never challenges anyone. So, yes, Francesco, I'm officially a huge fan. And honestly, while people love to criticize streaming platforms like Netflix, Spotify, or Prime Videos because they're giants and because of the implications of that kind of corporate world, I'm just grateful in a way because they're one of the few places, one of the few spaces that allow innovation to happen, where younger audiences can finally see something different, something that speaks to them. And this is happening for movies, TV shows, and comedies as well, with the first few stand up shows of Italian comedians also being on Netflix. And that's really fantastic to see. There's one specific show that actually inspired me to work on this episode in the first place, and it's one of the shows that I'm referring to when I talk about innovation, bringing new things in Italy through streaming platforms. And I'm talking about Prime Video's Roast in Peace, Italy's first real attempt to adapt the all American format of the roast. We're still very far from the merciless humor of shows like Kill Tony, but it's a good start. Roast in Peace is hosted by Michela Giraud, which is another rising star of modern Italian comedy. She also has a stand up special on Netflix. I don't know if it was the first one in Italian Netflix, but if it wasn't the first, it was definitely one of the very first ones. And the show, Roast in Peace, is set up like fake funeral where comedians read their funeral eulogy for Italian celebrities that have just passed away fictionally because they're there and they're the stars of this show. The celebrities that they have chosen come from completely different backgrounds. We have scandalous journalists, we have a writer who wrote about mafia and Camorra, and then we have a rich showgirl, and finally a legendary football player. Most of the comedians that are participating are part of this sort of new generation of comedians that I was referring to. And even if the roasts are pretty soft, to say the least, the format itself feels pretty bold for Italy, and it's definitely a promising start. Michela Giraud herself said that the hardest part was our cultural difficulty in accepting being made fun of. And she joked that Italians have the self irony of a beach log. And she's absolutely right. Famous people here don't enjoy being roasted, they don't laugh along, they sue you instead. So, just for you to know. That's why so far critics have different opinions about the shows. They say that the comedians still kept the dialectical handbrake on, meaning they held back from real confrontation. And unfortunately, that's just true. After all, even if the targets were celebrities, they're still safe peaks in a way. They're celebrities, but not people in power in itself, even though they are certainly very influential in their sector. But again, when I say that the roast was very soft, I mean that the funeral eulogy that I was saying is basically the comedian's monologue that is supposed to roast the celebrity of that particular episode. And they're very soft in the sense that they don't really go super sharp with the kind of topics that they even pick. They keep it very vague, and most of the time they also joke and roast about people and things that have nothing to do with the target, the actual target of the roast. And so, in a way, avoiding also focusing so much on that person alone. And this happens for all of them, but it's particularly evident in the fourth episode, where there's hardly any roasting at all. The target of that episode was Francesco Totti, a former captain of the Rome Calcio team and club, and huge Italian celebrity. Definitely one of the most successful soccer players in the past couple of decades, as well as a super popular celebrity in general in Italy, appearing on TV. Everybody knows his face, everybody knows his name. Just really our version of a Hollywood celebrity, basically. The comedians, in his case, just gave up, and their monologue was just praising. They were targeting more people. Again, they were not Francesco Totti, but other people. Even jokingly, some of them even jokingly apologized at some point for having to make those jokes for this show. They explicitly say that they wouldn't even dare tarnish his reputation in any way. So again, that's the whole point of the show. If this doesn't happen there, if you don't take a little bit of a risk with a very naughty or sharp joke about your idol, where else are you going to do that? I also would assume that if you go there as the celebrity with the role of the dead celebrity, you should also accept that this comes with, they're going to say things that if they were true and if they happened in another context, you would probably punch them in the face. And still, you gotta sit here and have a good laugh. That's what it's all supposed to be about. This is an even more special case because, as you know, if you listen to the previous episode about calcio and what it means for Italy and for Italians, you understand how joking and mocking such a huge calcio star can be met with a little bit of resistance. On the other hand, each episode ended after the four comedians read their eulogy for the celebrity of that episode, and after that it's the celebrities' turn to take their revenge on their comedians and have their roasting monologue as well. And that's where you see that the comedians had to be or chose to be very careful in their roasting, because when the celebrities were reading their own roasting monologue for the comedians, that you actually show a little bit more cutting jokes and sharper tones, because the perception is definitely that they could do that more than the comedians themselves could somehow. So the show really reveals how uncomfortable Italy still is with self-mockery and challenging authority, even for a joke, even in the context where this is actually supposed to happen. Unlike in the US, where they say we only roast the ones we love, here we still treat ridicule as an offense rather than affection. And personally, I devoured the show. I really liked it. It's not perfect, but I like to see innovative things happening. I like to see Italian artists being able to go beyond the comfort zone. And again, it featured some of my favorite comedians of this new wave of artists. So it's just really nice to see that they have this kind of opportunity. So what does Italian humor tell us about who Italians are today? First of all, we see that there's once again the triumph of the average Italian, the Italiano medio. The most commercially successful comedy still revolves around that that character, opportunistic, cynical, a little shallow. Checco Zalone today remains sort of the champion of this archetype because his humor comforts the audience instead of challenging them. But again, this is still a very successful thing. Italians like to see themselves represented on TV in a humorous way. We still see that there's a lot of persistence of sexism and superficiality in a way in the humor that is successful today. Much of mainstream humor, especially in the cinepanettoni, which are still a thing, by the way, still reduces women to stereotypes and plays it safe with social critique. So it's a little bit of a mirror of a side of Italy that is more consumerist, patriarchal, and it's still there. Another thing that we see is, again, a fear of a real social critique. Italian satire rarely bites, really. It often turns political figures into harmless cartoons, steering clear of discomfort or ethics. Self censorship and external pressure are really strong. This again, I imagine, it's a little bit of a limit also for new comedians that want to go there, want to adventure into those territories, but are not well accepted by mainstream media. But as we were saying, something is shifting. This new generation is breaking away from the sketches and the caricatures and embracing authentic stand-up comedy, where the comedy is the story. Humor doesn't seek easy laughter, it seeks the bitter laugh that comes when you recognize a truth that you would prefer to ignore, but in that spot, in that particular moment, it just makes you feel understood and it makes you have fun. Streaming platforms like Amazon Prime and Netflix are opening the door to those formats, and they are testing how far Italian audiences are willing to go. I guess things will change a lot more in the near future because it's still cautious. It's seeding the change that definitely are there to grow. Ultimately, the future of Italian comedy will depend on whether these new voices can overcome the old moralism and reclaim laughter as a tool of truth telling, a way to challenge power, not to comfort it. And of course, tell me, I want to hear from you. What's your favorite Italian comedian? Do you find Italian comedy funny or you think it's lost its old charm? Share your thoughts with me on Instagram at Voices of Italy and on Blue Sky or LinkedIn. Now we also have a page there. And don't forget that Voices of Italy now has its own website, voicesofitalypodcast.com. There you'll find all the episodes, the links to listen to the podcast on your favorite platform, more about the project, and a way to get in touch if you want to say hi, suggest a topic, or leave a feedback on the episode. It's a small milestone, but it means a lot. So thank you if you want to visit and take a look, and thank you if you want to follow the podcast and leave a review. It's really a huge help for this small adventure that is this podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode or on the website.